Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 244, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are taking another one of our new book breaks from this series on feminism, the story of women in the history and present and future of Judaism. It's actually a teaser for our next series of episodes, which is going to be about Jewish philanthropy, and we also talk a little bit about feminism, so it all interconnects. Our guest today is a returning guest, Lila Corwin Berman, and we're going to be talking about her brand new book, which was just published this past Tuesday, called The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution. It's an amazing read. For those of you who don't think that you would want to read a book about Jewish philanthropy, I think you're going to want to read this one. This is a book that we loved and we've been waiting for a long time because we really wanted to get into this question about how philanthropy impacts the world of Jewish institutions that we experience all the time. We're going to be doing a deep dive into that starting in a few weeks. But for now, we're really excited to talk to Lila Corwin Berman about this new book. So before we jump into the conversation, just a few words of introduction because Lila Corwin Berman is a returning guest. She's been a guest on Judaism Unbound twice already. So I'll just say that she is the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History at Temple University, where she directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. In addition to this book, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, she is also the author of Metropolitan Jews, Politics, Race, and Religion in Post-War Detroit, and, speaking of Jews, Rabbis, Intellectuals, and the Creation of an American Public Identity. We couldn't be more excited to have this conversation today, so Lila Corwin Berman, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. We are thrilled to have you here again.
Thank you so much.
So this book is titled The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, and it's about the American Jewish Philanthropic Complex. Can you help us understand a little bit what you mean when you describe the world of American Jewish philanthropy as a philanthropic complex?
Yeah, so I chose that word because it seemed like just a vivid imagery in a sense, and also it has multiple kinds of meanings, right? So, on one level, my point was this is a really complicated world. Like, there's complexity to it, right? But also that to understand American Jewish philanthropy, one can't just understand American Jewish philanthropy, right? That it, in fact, braids together a whole number of different kind of political and economic forces, American policies, tax law, political theory, and that to try to think about American Jewish philanthropy out of that kind of world of lots of forces kind of weaving together would really be to miss the way that the entire system works, right? So you could write about American Jewish philanthropy, I suppose, and just write about a few institutions and, have a very narrow sense of that. But my goal was really to try to show the kinds of intersections. And also, there's something I think psychological we think about when we hear the word complex, right? One has a complex, what kind of complex? And there's certainly a kind of psychological, emotionally weighty way that philanthropy has worked for Americans and very specifically for American Jews. And I also wanted to capture that.
When I hear complex, the first thing that I think about is Eisenhower and the military-industrial complex, meaning that I hear it as something to be worried about, not necessarily something terrible, but something to be worried about because it tends to have interests of its own beyond the interests that it's meant to serve. And is that something that you were trying to get at?
Absolutely. And that's also certainly, military-industrial complexes is meant to be an echo in the title. And yes, absolutely. Eisenhower was pointing to the sort of self-interest of a complex that ties together military producers with military decision makers. And in that same way, I was really interested in thinking about whose interests, whose desires are served by this system feeling like a closed system, an inevitable system, a natural system, right? Where there becomes a sort of feedback loop. Now, it doesn't always mean that there are like nefarious purposes. And, and I think that if you read Eisenhower's speech, he's worried about this kind of aggregation of power. But he also understands that when you're in these systems, they start to feel like impossible, in a sense, to break out of, right? They start to have a logic of their own. And so that element of complex was certainly on my mind.
I love that we're already talking about Eisenhower. First off, Eisenhower came up in your intro. I care less about Eisenhower specifically, and I care abundantly about the fact that your book is full of conversations throughout the 20th century, a little 19th at the beginning, but like about people like Eisenhower, like Nixon, like Reagan, like people that you're used to seeing in history books, but not, for me at least, so used to seeing in American Jewish history books. And I want to talk about that. Like I went to your index before this conversation and I found that there were 45 distinct entries under the term American state. And there were like different little sub-entries, like associations within the American state, and blah, blah, blah. And some of those are multiple pages. Like, this is a book that looks at how, I mean, to some extent, American Judaism generally, but like at least how Jewish institutions and Jewish philanthropy are affected. I mean, both are affected and sort of do their own affecting on America more broadly. And so that leads to like, oh, we're talking about congressional acts that might feel kind of obscure to some, like we're talking about specific legislation around tax codes and all of this stuff that like maybe doesn't sound sexy to people, but actually I found was really interesting. And all of a sudden it gave this sense of like, oh, this idea that American Jewish history is some like sideshow that we tell as a supplement to American history is not quite the only story. Like we can look at it as not only sort of being impacted by America generally, but also like it turns out some of the key players in the broader conversations about how our structures of society are set up, how philanthropy works generally. It turns out some of those people were Jews and like embedded in Jewish institutions. So like, can you talk to us about like what you're doing there? What you're looking at American Jewish history in some new ways that excite me, and like, I guess why, and what were some of those ways?
Yeah, well, you're a great reader, right? Because you just delineated in a lot of ways the kinds of what we would call, I guess, in the academic world, like interventions that I want to make about how people study the history of American Jews, in the scholarship of American history in the last decade, I would say, there's been a kind of conversation about whether or not it makes sense to talk about something called the state. I'll go through this in like a really simple way, like we could do a semester on this, but I won't make you do that. There was a sort of like regnant paradigm that the state was only important in places that had a really strong, like socialized state, right? So you talk about like the state in places in Europe because that state was like a key actor when it came to provisioning for all sorts of needs that its citizens had. And that in the United States, there really wasn't that kind of state. And so there's this historian who writes a really important article, and he says, this is the myth of the weak American state. But in fact, we should stop thinking about the American state as if it's a non-entity, because there are all sorts of ways that this thing that we call the state, right, which includes the federal government, which includes all the different branches of government, includes agencies, includes agents of those agencies, it acts upon people in all sorts of ways. And it has really been a key actor in the history of the United States. And we need to think about that. So this is something that, like, as I was writing this book, I'm thinking about. And I was thinking, in many ways, the history of American Jews is often told both as this kind of like triumphant story that Jews came to this country and they gained their citizenship and they worked their way up and, succeeded in this golden land. So with this like basic kind of kowtowing to America, But so little of it is told with any sense of, what did the state, what were the policies, what were the ways in which Jews were understood as citizens, as people who were able to take advantage of different kinds of federal programs for education, for home lending, whatever it might be. How is it impossible to tell that story of American Jews without telling a story about their interaction with the state? On one level, really, this book, and this is really when I'm kind of looking toward my colleagues and toward my field, is an attempt to say to them, let's really think about how some of the stories that we've told about American Jews, and frankly about American Jewish success, are not legible unless we understand the positionality of Jews within this kind of apparatus of the American state.
And can you talk a little bit about what that is? In other words, what is that interaction? I was fascinated at the beginning of the book to see the large role that a guy played who I'd never heard of before, named Norman Sugarman, who I believe was a tax lawyer. And we all have this vague sense, I guess, because we do our taxes every year, that charitable donations are tax deductible. But, we're talking about small amounts here. So I think that even those of us who basically understand how you can deduct charitable giving from your taxes don't really have a sophisticated mindset about how tax law and philanthropy really interplay in the ways that potentially lead to a complex. So can you give us a little bit of an economics lesson here?
Oh, sure. Okay, so here's the thing. I think it feels intuitive to think that when I am finding a particular nonprofit cause that means a lot to me, like feeding hungry people in my city, and I'm giving my money to that cause, I'm acting as an individual. I'm using the money that I earned to help a cause that I care about. But when you look at the architecture of what I'm doing and what that cause is doing, you have to really understand the political theory of how American government works, right? Which is really that there are all these different kinds of associations. We call them nonprofits, right? Groupings of collectives that decide that they have some kind of common cause that they're interested in. And these different associations or groupings come to have a particular status, right? And you also have the government subsidizing them, right? And that's how the tax exemption, which before there was an income tax deduction and all of that, there were property tax exemptions that associations got. They are, in a sense, pledging that they're going to do something that benefits the public. And in return, they're not going to then have what you could understand maybe as like the double burden of having to pay taxation, which is meant to benefit the public, right? Their very existence is benefiting the public. So long as they are able to convince the state bodies, whether it's the IRS or earlier different state governments, that they are trying to enact the public good and fulfill certain categories, that they then can, in a sense, get some public enrichment to do what they do. And so it both subsidizes them and also allows the state to have some control, right? It makes them visible. And so therefore not necessarily threatening to the state. So this all develops over time, right? So in the 19th century, the vast majority of these kinds of incorporated associations were churches, right? Were congregations. And there was not a great deal of concern that these churches were going to be holding huge amounts of wealth. And in fact, in the incorporation agreements, there was generally a requirement that the property not exceed a certain value. Because, the government was saying, like, we get that we're kind of giving you this as if it stands on the public side of the ledger. But if you start to become like, a massive landholder, we're not going to be able to tolerate that, right? As the tax code shifts and you have the establishment of the income tax, right, with the 16th Amendment, and you also have, a shifting kind of landscape of which kinds of institutions are seeking this sort of incorporation and are holding a great deal of capital, it absolutely becomes the case that you can understand this as essentially more and more private actors and institutions holding onto public dollars.
First off, I want to encourage people, like some of what you just said calls back to previous episodes we've had with you. And I think that doing a marathon, Lila, Corwin, Berman on Judaism Unbound would help all of this sink in really good ways. So we're going to put those in the show notes on our website in this episode. So that's number one. A bunch of things just arose in what you just spoke about that I think require us, or at least encourage me to want to get nitty gritty. So I'm asking this with the knowledge that, like, as a listener out there, hey, everyone, this might sound very dense, but I think it's interesting and important. So a few things. One, you talked about shifts in how associations structured themselves, especially around how much money they hold at any one time. One of the most important teachings I've gained from this book and from some of your other work over the years is that it was a choice. Like, certain things that we take for granted about our world today, we think just sort of are that way, right? But what a good historian does is they say, oh, that was the product of a bunch of choices. One choice was that organizations decided that the route that we now think of as endowments, of holding sometimes an immense amount of money, as opposed to circulating it out, like, or almost all of it or all of it out regularly. That was a choice that was made. And now we take for granted that if you're talking about universities, if you're talking about Jewish nonprofits, if you're talking about, like, an endowment is like what you strive to create because you want to be sustainable, you want to have a long-term future. So you put a bunch of money in reserves in case anything terrible would happen, so that you're sort of safe. But initially, and you started to talk about this, initially that was viewed with a lot of scrutiny, especially because of what you just talked about with these organizations being deemed nonprofit and deemed sort of the public good. And so initially, you talk about Jewish federations, they had in their bylaws, they had like official policies that said, we will not hold on to, I mean, you'll remember better than me, like the precise numbers or the percentages of, we will circulate out every year at least X percentage of our money. We won't hold it in reserves. So, like, one turning point I noticed was you talk about Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff is talked about. He's actually one of the characters in this book that is spoken about in other works of American Jewish history, but from a very different angle. You talk about a very specific thing Jacob Schiff did was he gave a massive gift. How much was it? 500,000?
Right. So Jacob Schiff, in his will, says, and this is published in the New York Times, right? So everybody would have, like, if they wanted to, would have read his will. You know, he says that I want to give, once I pass away, $500,000 to New York's Federation, right? He knows that they have in their bylaws a stipulation that they don't want to hold on to reserves like that. But he's basically saying, I want to force your hand to build up more reserves. And so, like, on the fly, you know, like, you can imagine sort of the lawyers standing there, the check sort of being dangled, whatever it might be. The board of trustees has to decide, are they going to change what had been their bylaws, which, you know, were written out of this sort of sense, both a principled sense and a practical sense. Principled sense, they said, we don't want to be some kind of charity trust organization that just holds on to money, right? This is the critique of the Gilded Age. We have a purpose, and we're not that kind of, like, organization. The practical thing is, it's not like they had much opportunity to hold tons and tons of capital. Yes, there were some wealthy Jews, but this is a period, we're talking here in the 1920s, right, when you had lots of Jews coming in after World War I, when you had Jews who'd come in prior to the war who needed a lot of material help. So those two reasons, they were not holding on to very much money in reserves or in endowment. And Schiff says, well, I have this money and I want you to hold it in reserve. And so they change their bylaws, right? And they decide, oh, okay, like, here we have this possibility. And, you know, maybe we can shift things. They still kind of keep the spirit of not trying to go out and get bequests like that, not trying to go out and get money that they're going to be able to hold on to and not distribute. But it does cause this shift. And, you know, when you're saying the book shows that people make choices about the policies that come to seem so natural and real, people are not always aware. So you're very right about what you said in terms of my perspective. And it's not always the case that those choices are made with an awareness of what they will necessarily lead to. There are decisions and choices made that, you know, lead down certain paths. You know, it doesn't mean that it was the absolute purpose or self-conscious purpose to say, oh, now we're going to try to, like, raise these huge endowments, right? It's much more of a, you know, different steps along a path that we only see in retrospect.
How do we go from that place of, okay, we're going to make this change because we want to accept a huge gift from Jacob Schiff, to a place a few decades later, eventually a few generations later, where we take for granted that we hold a great amount of money in reserves and sort of structure the entire project around that. What happens there?
So there are a few other moments when federations like New York are presented with the possibility to have some of these larger gifts, right? But there's also a Great Depression. Federations, and certainly New York's federation, like spends down to the very, very bottom. You know, you have the president of the federation saying in the early 1930s, like, I know what I did. Like, we're not holding anything back. I know there's nothing left. And we're going to just keep on raising what we can every single year and shooting it all out to the people who need it. Nonetheless, what's really interesting, I think, is that, you know, in the wake of the Great Depression and then after World War II, again, this issue kind of percolates to the surface of like, okay, but there are these people who have made a great deal of money, who are in a position to give far more to the Federation of New York, for example, than it spends every year. You start to hear from some of the leaders of that institution things like, well, how can you tell people who've made a lot of money that they need to give it to us only in a particular way? People want to say, for example, that here's a bunch of money and I want to make sure that it's restricted to be used in X, Y, or Z way. And this is like, you know, countercultural, really, for these institutions. This is not how it worked. But you start to hear some of the board members say, you know, I can be kind of sympathetic to this. And we don't want them then just bypassing us and giving just to these agencies. We've done a lot of work to make sure that doesn't happen. So let's see if we can create a kind of structure so that these people can still feel like the Federation is like the central address, to use an anachronistic phrase, but a phrase that starts to be used like in the 60s, 70s, and that we can give them what they want. So they feel good about giving their money to us. This remains a point of contention. And like one of my favorite moments when I was reading over meeting minutes from the board of directors of New York's Federation was when there's a couple old guys in the room and they look around and they're like, you spring chickens. None of you were around when this institution started. I see only, you know, this guy and that guy. And we all know we hashed this out. We had this conversation. We don't want to go down that path. And where are you taking us? And the young guys are like, whatever. You know, history is history. And we're in a new time. There's new access to capital we have. And in fact, like the market's working differently. And not only should we be taking this money, we should be investing it and we should be growing it. So we're talking here now about like the 40s, the 50s, and Cleveland comes up because Cleveland is this really innovative place when it comes to American philanthropy. And this is not just the case for Jewish philanthropy, but more generally. And they don't have, I think, the same sort of like dug in sense that persists in New York, that like, if we're going to go down this route, it's going to be that like, we're really thumbing our noses at that old guard. And so in the 50s, they start to say, we'll hold on to this money that you want to allocate philanthropically, and we'll give you a fair amount of control, right? We'll create these mini kinds of trust funds, but don't go do them at that community foundation. Like, do it at your federation, do it here, and it's going to be a win-win, right? Like, you're going to get to do what you care about, and you're going to get to support us. And this is really like part of the very, very early beginnings of the architecture of donor advised funds. And again, like this is this massive, like it's an economic change. There's all the sort of finance side to it. But I like to also think about what the cultural shift is. You know, what did it mean to go from thinking that the rule was that every time money came in, it went out annually, and that in fact, that process was what convinced people to give and to give more, to thinking that really the rule was that this institution was meant to be building its corpus, right? It was meant to be expanding the capital that it sat upon, even if the access to that capital was in many ways sort of given to certain individual donors, right, who had the ability to advise where that money went. That's a massive change in just how you think about community.
Yeah, I'll never forget a conversation that I once had with a donor who gave us a substantial, not this current project, but gave a project that I was leading a substantial amount of money, and basically said, I want you to do good with this money this year, and next year was the 2-year pledge. And after that, Whatever, meaning like, I'm not saying to you that this is to help you build this organization into whatever it's going to be next, which tends to be how I try to sell what I'm doing, where we're going, a vision, and he was saying, no, I like what you're doing right now and I want to support it. And I haven't had that many conversations. I think a lot of times that's what people who are giving smaller amounts are thinking. But conversations about large amounts tend to be some version, not necessarily that you're putting in an endowment, but some version of kind of giving you fuel to this long-term vision. I think that my question that sort of relates to all this is like, to what extent are some of these choices really able to be made by people versus how much is the state's policy just so powerful that really there is no other choice, and I think about both a philanthropist, like you write about Julius Rosenwald, who was one of the leaders at Sears and a very wealthy person. And he tried to do a different way to some extent. He did have a foundation, but he tried to do more of a giving the money all in a shorter period approach. And so one person can buck the system, but the question is are there any other fields of philanthropy, or fields of endeavor that made a profoundly different choice and didn't go along with where the tax policy was leading? Or really did the Jewish community just make the choice that every other community in America made because American policy is just so powerful?
There's a couple ways of approaching that. One piece to understand is it's not just that, these Jewish institutions followed the design of tax policy, but in fact, there were certain people who were very involved in these Jewish institutions who designed pieces of tax policy. Somebody like Norman Sugarman, right, who I talk about a lot in the book, but a number of other heads of Jewish organizations and then heads of other philanthropic organizations that start to kind of all talk together about what do we need to do to advance our interests. And they really zero in on tax policy. They work with Congress, and then they work with the Department of Treasury to create code that makes it so that, the logic I explained to you earlier that, well, I'm getting this deduction or this exemption because the money is already falling on the public ledger. You could ask, well, is it really falling on the public ledger if it's not actually doing anything, right? Like it's in an account, it's invested in stock, and it's growing. And my the intent is it's going to go somewhere charitably, but that could be tomorrow or that could be in 50 years or more. There's no time limit. It's not just sort of responding to policy and this is this sort of like path that it had to go on because policy is shaping it, but it's also shaping policy in terms of a path that certain people decided was going to be the best way of giving more power to these kinds of philanthropic entities and to their private supporters. It's certainly not just Jewish organizations in this post-World War II period that get in the game of doing this, right? Some of the leaders of these Jewish organizations, and especially the staff members, understand how wise it is to be in coalition with presidents of universities, with the leaders of other big charitable organizations like the United Way. And they do create groups, right, where they're all talking to each other and they're delineating what their shared priorities are and trying then to lobby on behalf of those priorities together. It is worth thinking about which kinds of institutions and communities don't have access to sort of being in this game. And the one that, is most obvious are African-American institutions. It's not the case that they don't create endowments and don't open donor advised funds and community foundations. They do. But the access that they have to capital in order to create the kind of heft in these sorts of funds is so much less. So if you compare the endowments of historically Black colleges and universities to those of other universities, it's completely disparate, right? There is a wide gulf that exists. You have to have a sense of a fair amount of, capital that can be placed in these kinds of institutions in order to really take advantage of these structures and in order to really want to be in the game of creating them. One of the things I heard persistently from the 100 or so people I spoke to who were incredibly generous and smart and interesting was we see some of these problems. Like, we're not thrilled about the kinds of power that dollar for dollar this gives wealthier donors. But like, this is the world we're operating in. What could we possibly do? And I get that. And at the same time, there are a few things that I think make that not a totally satisfying way of thinking about things. So first of all, there are moments of resistance. In certain institutions, even at this moment, we're seeing that happening, right? Where people are, even the Ford Foundation deciding to take a lot of debt in order to spend a lot more money. So that can happen. There are also certain religious institutions. There's this really interesting piece that comes out in 1968 about taxation. And you have a group of mainly Protestant clergy kind of saying, like, why do we get all of these tax benefits? What is my church really doing for the public good? And like these are these very liberal kinds of Protestant groups. Our interest that we have stated is in helping remedy the injustice of this world. And how can we be doing that when what we're basically doing is perpetuating it by this exemption, by this deduction, right? Like that we are not really like paying our due to the structures in place to help people, to be a safety net for people. So you have people who recognize, who are able to articulate, like, this isn't how things should be. Then the last thing I would say is you also have plenty of institutions, and Jewish institutions do this certainly, who lobby not only to maintain these policies or these rules, but also to strengthen and augment them. And we saw this with some of what happened with debate about Trump's tax plan, right? Which was threatening certain elements of how deduction worked, right? And you saw Jewish federations, really come out very, very strong to say, no, we cannot, tax reform in certain ways might be good and whatever else. But when it comes to charitable giving, we need to make sure it is as attractive as possible. And this means giving the most tax benefits as possible, which happens in this kind of regressive way, meaning that those at the top get the most of those benefits.
You talked about how we notice, both notice and affect a change in organizations going from, circulating, dispersing a great deal of their resources all the time to a mindset of thinking, okay, it's about sort of sustainability, continuity, making sure that we have an endowment so that we can exist for a long time. I'm curious the extent to which you see that as being tied in Jewish life to the Holocaust. From my perspective, it feels like really apparent that for a community of people to observe 1/3 of their numbers, I'm talking about they as if it's not me. I'm part of this community. For a community of people to observe 1/3 of our numbers be murdered automatically brings up questions of the existence of that group of people. Not that those questions weren't ever there. I think Jews for a very long time have been thinking about our existence because we're a minority group and we're constantly nervous about everything from assimilation to oppression, everything else. But I think the Holocaust is a game changer here. And I'm curious whether you see that as sort of playing a primary role in this mindset of, we have to think about the future. We have to think about sustainability, not just sort of day-by-day needs of Jews in this country that the Federation could serve, that the agencies could serve. But we have to think about the existence of like Judaism, but also like literal Jewish human beings for generations to come. Because the second that's your question, it makes a great deal of sense for the donor going to Dan or anybody else to be like, I'm actually not thinking about today or this week or this year, but the work that we're doing in general to ensure and here's where the word comes in, the continuity of Judaism. So I'm curious whether you see that as like a primary factor or just like additional factor to what was already happening with the American state.
So before Jews in the United States start to use the word continuity in the way that you were referencing it, they use the word survival even more so, right? And you continue to see that word in the continuity conversations as well. But even in kind of earlier conversations about the future of Jewry or American Jewry, the idea of survival, in a sense, is sort of walking in tandem with people starting to encounter survivors of the Holocaust, right? And thinking about what is the obligation now of the people themselves who might have survived the Holocaust, and also this community of people who, not that they necessarily could have done anything, but that they, this was on some level like on their watch, even as they weren't quite sure what was happening or what they might have been able to do. The trauma of that, trying to encounter this cataclysmic event, trying to understand what lesson it may have, all of these forces are operating in tandem, and I think do end up kind of putting a particular force on the idea of the future, on the idea that like the mission must be to firmly and confidently say there will be a Jewish future, and we will make sure that there is a Jewish future. And at the same time, to harness some of this abundance, right? And you certainly hear in social criticism of the 1950s and in fiction of the 1950s, like a discomfort with that abundance and anxiety, right? My colleague Rachel Cranston has written some really good work about that kind of anxiety of affluence, right? And part of that does have to do, I think, with this discomfort that like you have this whole group of Jews who were totally eviscerated, who were killed, who were starved, who had no access to this. And yet these American Jews who are gaining access to it. And this really like difficult question that I think gets sort of sidelined is, would this money have been able to make a difference, right? Would it have created a different outcome, for what happened in Germany? And I think that in many ways, the answer is that people acknowledge it probably wouldn't have. But nonetheless, like this is the tool that American Jews start to feel like they have. Right. And you see it when it comes to American Jews' relationship with Israel as well, right? Building a future, of rebuilding a sense of security after this profound kind of insecurity that global Jewry has felt. So it's not at all perplexing that you see people then wanting to invest in the future and wanting to create some kind of assurance that whatever else exists in the future, like there will be this perpetual way that Jewish life is going to exist. And that the two poles of that have to do with identity and have to do with finance. And especially as it's the case that fewer and fewer Jews living in the United States need to rely on Jewish charitable organizations for their daily needs, there is more money and there's more ability for philanthropies to raise money, and there aren't those pressing material needs. And there's this sense of the future and needing to kind of capitalize the future, and this sense of fear that without that kind of like European pole of thick Jewish existence, how is Jewish identity going to exist in the future, right? And the 1950s is a time like in psychology when there's all this talk about what identity is and how it works. And so all of this kind of comes together to create the foundations for a very identity-focused philanthropy, and that identity-focused philanthropy always has its eyes on the future. And that's where this kind of idea of continuity, I think, becomes very, very important. An idea that really, it puts a particular kind of pressure on women. The money itself is being managed almost exclusively by men. There are women's auxiliary groups and there are women's societies, and women are a huge amount of the volunteer labor of these organizations. But a lot of the shots are being called by men, and it is businessmen and eventually lawyers who serve on the boards, male lawyers for the most part. And yet this kind of investment in this future directed identity starts to really narrow down to these ideas of fertility, right? Of like reproduction. And then literally, right? It's not just a metaphor. It's like literally making sure that enough Jewish babies are born.
Yeah, I actually want to build on that because we've been doing this series on the history of Jewish women, on feminism, past, present, and future, as I was reading your book. And I was especially struck by one picture. There's a lot of really good pictures in the book, but there's this one picture from the 70s, and it's this family, ostensibly a father and a mother and 3 kids, and the 3 kids are all wearing a T-shirt that says, "My dad upped his pledge," I guess to the Federation. And the mom's standing right there, and it says, "My dad upped his pledge," and that felt to me like so extremely telling. I'd love for you to take this question wherever you want to take it, but I was thinking about a couple of things. One was the the story, the famous story within a certain amount of Jewish insiders of the Federation Convention in 1969, when there was this kind of uprising by younger Jews, college age, a little older maybe, that were demanding that the Jewish Philanthropies federations fund education more. And it doesn't surprise me in a certain way that when you have people who are from a certain type of business and big law firms and whatever, not to paint with a broad brush, that you're going to end up with a orientation towards continuity being fundamentally something that's oppressive towards women, that sees women as a vehicle rather than a person. Those same firms tend to have huge problems with whether it's having enough women working there or sexual harassment. So it doesn't really surprise. And it just kind of leads me to wonder, again, back to this question of like, are the forces just so powerful that we're going to have to figure out how to do the best we can with this system that we've inherited? Or at least now that there are a lot more women involved in these organizations, are we seeing changes? Do we imagine that changes are possible, or are the forces still too strong?
We can make change. That's like, honestly, it became one of the reasons that I kept writing this book, because it became clear to me that it's not just what it is. It became what it was, and it can become something else, but I'll get there. So first of all, do you know what's on the back? I don't actually have confirmation on this, but I think what's on the back of those t-shirts?
No.
Up yours. My dad upped his pledge, up yours, right? Somebody, maybe one of your listeners will tell me that's not correct, and that's urban legend, insofar as there are urban legends about Jewish Federation t-shirts. In a certain sense, that maybe gets at some of the masculinity of this world. That this became a place where Jewish men were working out, what it meant to be an American Jewish man, and dealing with stereotypes or anti-Semitic ideas that followed the idea of Jewish men not being manly enough, not being providers, sort of being controlled by women. I think in a sense, it could be the story. It's not the story I tell, and I really hope that others will dig into it and be able to tell it. But this became a realm of men hanging out with each other, not just in a professional context, right? Not just in their occupations or doing work, but really kind of articulating their values. It's not just a side note, even though in the book it's not the central feature that I explore, that these systems were primarily manned by men, right? The language about continuity and that identity finance braiding together that we just talked about really, I think, is quite revelatory of the masculinity of this philanthropic realm, right? So federations and other Jewish communal organizations in the 60s and 70s start to do a great deal of demographic research about who is in the Jewish population, how is it changing, what region is it going to, and also who are Jews marrying and how many children are they having. And one of the kind of primary findings that they really alight on as being so important is that as women are having more access to higher education and more access to professions, the fertility rate of Jews is declining. And you have people who, start to talk about zero population growth among American Jews, and this like incredible fear that is harnessed in certain ways to different kinds of fundraising campaigns, frankly, that there may not be any Jews of tomorrow. And, these male leaders talking about how there needs to be programs created and there needs to be money used to start these programs so that Jews can be part of this kind of mission of continuity. And is saying quite squarely that, when you have women who don't understand what their position is in all of this, who've not been taught through their institutions, right, not to just go off and put having babies on hold. Women need to be instructed in that. Like, they have a specific role in continuity. And maybe those programs can be capitalized better to let that happen. Basically, like, I would say it's fair to call it a kind of patriarchal assumption to the way that this identity-based, continuity-driven, future-driven philanthropy comes to work in the later part of the 20th century.
So on that front, and connected to the various issues that we've opened up thus far today, I want to just sort of notice that This is a book called The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, and it's sort of conceivably about economics and money and donor-advised funds and tax codes and all that nitty-gritty stuff. But here we are, we're talking about sexism, we've talked about continuity, we've talked about Israel, we've talked about all these words, phrases, and actual sort of the content of those words and phrases that are among the most central questions of contemporary Jewish life. My question is, why is it useful to us to have a book like this? In what ways is it so important for us to have a book like this that starts us in a starting place that we might not expect, with economics, with philanthropy, as a way, as a channel into all these questions that we know are so central to Jewish life today?
In so many ways, like in our modern liberal capitalist existences, the default is to think on the individual levels, right? And we see this now happening in conversations about racism and anti-racism, right? Is the question whether I myself am a racist or an anti-racist is the better question. What are the structures within which I operate, within which we all operate, that are themselves racist or anti-racist, right? So much of the vocabulary of late 20th century and early 21st century American Jewishness has been individualized. And you could say the same for feminism, and you could say the same for all sorts of other kinds of movements and groups and activism. I hope that one of the insights from this work is that we have to always kind of keep in balance whatever choices and decisions individuals are making with the structures that, first of all, their choices and decisions help create, and then that their choices and decisions respond to, right? That there's always that kind of sense of movement. And, one of the things that would frustrate me when I would tell people I was working on this book is people would say, yeah, we get it. Like, wealthy people have a lot of power and they call a lot of shots. And like, that kind of sucks, but it's always been how things are. And I started to feel angry, like, okay, yeah, like maybe there's a sort of like phenomenological approach we could take and, say that this is this eternal thing. But like these things have histories. They weren't always the same at all. We've talked about some of those histories. And in a very constructive way, when we're able to appreciate ways that things have changed in the past, we stop being able to say like, it is what it is. Not at all, right? Like, yes, we need to name and say what the conditions are that exist today and where they came from. And that doesn't mean that we are just like stuck in these iron cages. Are these the structures we want to be part of? And if not, what should we do to change it, right? And it doesn't mean that we as individuals have all the power to change it. But one thing we can start to do is understand how these different structures work, right? And start to ask questions of the leaders, of the people who speak for our communities, who are in power in our communities, or exit from some of them and start our own ways of doing things. Exiting it can come with incredible costs, right? I'm not going to say that it's necessarily an easy thing to do. And just blowing it all up is maybe also just not a smart thing to do, strategically speaking, whatever your ends are. But, when it comes to how this can help people who are your listeners, who are thinking about how to make Jewish life more meaningful to them, more meaningful in the world that they care about, the very baseline thing is really trying to understand, like, where did some of the assumptions about how it has to be come from? And which ones can we push at in different directions? Because they've been pushed at in the past.
I'm wondering whether COVID in some way is a stress test on the system, on this complex, in the sense that I was thinking as you were talking earlier about some of the possibilities, like with COVID, you might have said, well, look, we're in a very particular situation right now. We're used to allocating only the 5% that we allocate every year. This year, we should be allocating, 25% because we've got to be saving these organizations. Otherwise, they're just not going to make it. But it doesn't strike me that that's what's happening. It feels more like there's changes in the allocation of that 5%, but there's still a fundamental sense that we're continuing to operate the way that we've always operated, because that's how things operate, as opposed to seeing COVID as an opportunity to kind of rethink the whole system. I'm wondering if that's what you're seeing, and are you seeing some people making other decisions, like the Ford Foundation in the outside the Jewish world, that took on debt so that they could give more, so that they could then pay that out later. And, I guess they're going to figure that all out on the other end of it, which is a reasonable position, I think, in a crisis. And I ask all that not necessarily because COVID is the most important thing in the world from a Jewish philanthropy standpoint. It may or may not be. We don't know. But what this podcast has been about for 5 years has been a hypothesis that we're undergoing a major change in the very nature of what it is to be Jewish. My question fundamentally is whether the philanthropic structures that we have are capable of being part of that transition, or that fundamentally, and this is another example that we've used from the beginning of the show, that the analogy is that we have to be thinking about at the time of the destruction of the temple, that there was a certain set of philanthropies that were probably generously funding the school for priest education and very, funding the operation that, fixes the menorah. And all of those things really are going to be irrelevant. But realistically, that's where the structures are going to have to go, because it's too built in, it's too baked into the entire system to change them. And so what we really should be focusing on is building new structures that support the new Judaism.
Yeah, it's so hard to know, like you said, where this might go. And, I think when I was on a prior episode sort of talking specifically about philanthropy and COVID, like I said, it just seems like crisis can do, this is like a maddening pundit sounding comment, right? But like crisis can either cause major points of inflection and change, or it can make people like double down and just want to hold on to whatever makes them secure. There's a recent initiative that I've learned about called the Jewish Future Pledge, right? Which is an effort to get not just wealthy, but especially wealthy Jewish philanthropists to say that in their charitable estate planning, they will earmark, sometimes by legally binding instruments, 50% of the money to, quote, Jewish values and or state of Israel matters. And, so this was announced like in March, and there's been a flurry of information about it, including a recently announced partnership with Morgan Stanley. That doesn't indicate to me like a shift in how people are thinking, but it also, like, and maybe this is me being really Pollyanna-ish, there's something so just wearing it all on the sleeve, like putting it all out there about something like that, that makes me think there is going to be this awareness that's going to continue to build. And we see it because there's a broader set of voices who are asking some really tough questions about philanthropy, but also just about the privatization of so many public goods in American life. And like that conversation is happening, and it's going to affect how American Jews think about their institutions and their communities. And so then when you have something like this Jewish Future Pledge, which is just like, it's all hanging out there, what's going on, maybe there's going to be more available vocabulary and critical tools that more people have. And I hope my work is like a little piece of that, to start to ask some questions and say like, okay, but like, is this good for, let's say, democracy? Like that's something a lot of us are worried about right now. And so should we be fueling philanthropic institutions that not only in their own practices and methods, but even in their implications when it comes to things like economic inequality, seem to be acting quite contrary to the interests of democracy, right? And if that's the case, like, okay, maybe we need to like name that, say it, and think about what the course correction is going to look like, right? Does that mean investing and involving more people in the procedures of giving out this money that's raised, right? Having a more diverse sense of who the Jewish people are, who should be having a voice in, how Jewish philanthropy works, right? And how much goes to Israel versus how much goes to other kinds of organizations, right? Do we want so many donor advised funds, billions of dollars, to be held by Jewish organizations, by public charitable organizations that are, Jewish communal funds and Jewish federations, with this money that is invested in the investment economy, but isn't doing anything else, right? Could more and more of it at least be lent out? For Jewish communities, this could be a moment of some reckoning with their own kinds of power structures.
I kind of want to close in the way that your book closes, which you bring up, you talk about resource generation. And I think I mean, you talk about a couple other projects at the end of your book too, but I think Resource Generation is really interesting precisely in how it relates to what you just said in terms of this is an organization for people who have inherited a great deal of wealth and are directly, explicitly asking big questions about what to do with that inheritance. And I see that both as a literal thing, and I also see that as a metaphor for like what we should be doing right now. We've inherited collectively as Jews, as Americans, all sorts of things, assumptions, in some cases, money, institutions, like asking the questions of what we do with those assumptions, with those institutions, with like, that's kind of the project of our show in many ways. So with Resource Generation, it's literal. It's people who have money they've inherited and and they're thinking about how to allocate it in a justice-driven way. So I'd love to hear like why you closed with them in particular. I loved it. I'm just curious, like what's there. And the other piece that I'm sure a lot of our listeners are interested in is this is like a risky book from some perspectives, right? Like this is a book about Jews and money. It's not only about that. It's about many, many things. But like on some level, somebody who wanted to misread it in a variety of directions probably could. And I know that you knew that going in. You even talk about it in your intro itself. Like what did it look like for you to address that in your research and in your book? For anybody who's listened to this episode and is like concerned that like you didn't take adequate care in the face of anti-Semites who could access this, like what would you say to those folks?
One thing that was really interesting when I talked to folks who are involved in Resource Generation, which it's not a Jewish organization, it has what their leaders and participants would describe as a lot of Jews who are involved in it, and also a lot of women, a lot of people who are queer in various ways. So one of the things that the folks I talked to said to me was that when they became involved in Resource Generation, they felt like they had to do a fair amount of introspection about what it meant for them as Jews to be involved in an organization that was really explicitly talking about the problems of what they said, and this was their terminology, of hoarding wealth. And when I heard that, my response was like, whoa, that's really tricky, right? So, you know, you're coming to this organization as a Jew, you're deciding to identify yourself as being a Jewish person. And then part of your process is to kind of like encounter this question. And, you know, they said to me that one of, and this was, you know, there's something scripted about this, like as, you know, many of these organizations sort of give people language and they start to filter their experiences through a similar kind of language. And that was something I noted. But most of the folks I spoke to said that there was something that gave them a great deal more sense of compassion for the families that they had come from, that they had felt pretty critical of by the time they kind of got involved in Resource Generation, when they started to think about what the money and holding on to the money meant to those families, and why many of them described families that had a great deal of resources and a lot of secrecy, for example, around money, and had a lot of rules around how money could be spent and who could spend it and what kinds of obligations you had if you're spending it. And, you know, this sense that like money itself is like a deeply emotional kind of experience. And for families, money is something that translates into all of these other kinds of relationships and tensions and, you know, ways of dealing with trauma, really. And of course, it did make me reflect on, you know, what does it mean for me to be writing this book that is, you know, like trying to expose the workings of this kind of system and, you know, I think has real legitimacy to it. And also, like, I'm a Jewish person. I have benefited immeasurably from Jewish philanthropy. And, you know, is there something of this of like, you know, poking at this sort of raw part of American Jewish life, while it has been the thing that has enabled me to do what I do, right? And poking at this piece that, like, you know, yeah, there are other people who poke at it, and they're really horrible anti-Semitic people and groups, right, who use ideas of Jews, you know, controlling capital as a way to justify, you know, really heinous ideas about who belongs and who doesn't belong, and harness a lot of hatred. Those concerns were really ones that I thought a lot about. And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons that it's important for me to think and to hope that there are constructive ways that people who read this book and interact with these ideas will be able to move forward to ask new and better questions of Jewish institutions. It's not my typical posture as a historian to say, I really want this to help people today lead their lives. Like maybe we all do on some level, right? But like for this one, being a little bit more out there with it. And, I've been involved in some other groups where I'm starting to kind of say, okay, what are some actual practices that Jewish philanthropic organizations could do? That seemed important. Like this is not just about trying to, expose something in a way and just, tear it down for the purpose of just criticism or worse, right? But as I say in the book, like at the end of the day, you don't have control. Like I have control over the words that I use. I have control over the care with which I took, to document what I was doing, to use archives, to use citations, right? All the tools that we as historians use. And that's not going to guarantee that, in the wrong hands, this could be read in a way that is deeply upsetting to me and potentially dangerous. In my mind, I still think that silence about this would be worse. We need to be able to talk about American Jews and money. A sense of this being a closed topic, as I was told directly by certain people who work in Jewish philanthropy, don't touch the money, right? Like this was directly told to me. I don't think that solves any problems. And that's certainly not going to, disarm anti-Semitism any better than talking about it is going to disarm anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. As always, I've enjoyed it.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can check out Twitter or Instagram, also Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. Noticing a theme, Judaism Unbound, Judaism Unbound, Judaism Unbound. And you can go to our email addresses. Send us emails, lex@JudaismUnbound.com or dan@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way, and you can do that via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.